morning. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. Today's meeting will focus on the ethnicity pay gap, and we encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag #AssemblyEconomy. We've just got a few short formal businesses to go through first. Can everybody please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Do we have apologies, please?
Thank you, Chairman. We received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Dismore and Assembly Member Russell, for whom Assembly Member Cooper and Assembly Member Berry are attending as substitutes. Apologies for absence have also been received from Assembly Member Arnold.
Fine, thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, thank you. Can we agree the minutes of our previous meeting on the 12th of March 2019? Thank you. And can we note the outstanding actions from the previous meeting? Thank you. Now this brings us to today's main item for discussion on the ethnicity pay gap in London. The main focus of the discussion will be to examine career progression for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities within the workplace and to assess the Mayor's approach and identify further actions that he can take. So first of all, can I welcome all of our guests. We have Simon Woolley, the Chair of the Race Disparity Audit Advisory Group. Andrew, and I'm sorry we got your name wrong previously, Andrew Fairbairn, Chief Executive Officer, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, London. Maxine Albert, Deputy Head of Diversity and Inclusion, House of Commons. Jennifer Crook, Head of Diversity and Inclusion, House of Commons. And Joanna Westhauser, Inclusion and Diversity Advisor, Business in the Community. Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to start the questions if I may. And Simon, if I ask you first, do you know why the pay gap is so volatile? For BAME women, it was 17% in 2014, but 28% in 2016.
Yes. I guess there are a number of factors generally, and then specifically to the volatility. I guess generally speaking, there are a number of key areas in which we can see why we have this chronic, if you like, pay gap, particularly to women and young people. I guess the first point is the race penalty has to be perhaps the biggest factor, and that's characterised in a number of ways. That whether we like it or not, that those from minority backgrounds are still being prejudiced when they apply for work, and that has been seen in a number of experiments in which Black people have applied for jobs with foreign-sounding names, and those applications have gone in the bin, and those with English names have been interviewed and or called for an interview, even though it's been the same person. And so we see the race penalty being a key factor. Just getting an interview, much less a job. And then when people get into jobs, for me it's so saddening that when you see Black talent are in positions and they've spent sometimes 5-10 years in the National Health Service or the police or other public bodies, and then they will then tell you that somebody comes into that job with less experience, and within 5 minutes they've been promoted above them, and they cannot do anything about it. So the first point is the race penalties, and that sadly starts from entry level to middle management to senior management. Yesterday, the Daily Telegraph reported on the FTSE, I think 350, and said that less than 3% are from Black and minority ethnic communities. And I'm sure the panel will have remembered the Operation Black Vote's groundbreaking work with The Guardian called The Colour of Power. And what we did in that report, and it's still live, in 2016, is that we looked at all those different facets of our society. I guess the men and women that run our country. The local institutions, local political institutions, national institutions, those key areas in business, such as law, accountancy, consultancy, publishing, media in general, 28 areas of our society which are critical to who we are and how our society is run. And what we looked at, Chair, was who runs these institutions, these companies. And of 1,030, it was less than 3%. For women, it was 0.1%. So of 1,030, 30 were black and minority ethnic. And most of them, I should say, were in the public sector and or politics. In the business centre, it was lamentable. So that was the top tier. My worry, and I don't have the data, but it's anecdotal, it's not just the top tier, but it's also that tier below where there's a massive deficit. Now, I'm sure during this conversation, we'll talk about some of the drivers that either impede or make it happen. Because, of course, when you look at the drivers, that you cannot have this discussion unless you go back to education, early schooling, secondary, and university, because they're the key drivers that either have pathways to build people in or to lock people out. So they're my opening statements, if you like, around the, as we've wanted to see with the race disparity unit, laying bare those uncomfortable truths. Just to add with that opening statement, so we lay bare the uncomfortable truths, but here's the upside. I think that it's not surprising we are doing this in London, this kind of scrutiny. But if we get it right here in our capital, if you are bold enough to make the recommendations and drive the change through, like we're trying to do with the race disparity unit, you will be a beacon. You will be a beacon to not just Londoners, but to the rest of the country and beyond. Because in many ways, London's like a city-state. People want to come here, if in this capital, Susan, we have these pathways for people to fulfill their potential, everybody benefits.
I know, Simon, which is why we've got this meeting, because I absolutely agree with you, and it's something, it's my last meeting as chair, and it's something I specifically wanted to look at. So very, very briefly, if you will, because I must bring in other people as well. So why do you think it's so volatile? Because
yes, I forgot
to
the
go
volatility.
back, it was 17% and
I did.
28%.
I forgot the volatility. I mean, I think in many ways, there are two factors for that: austerity and Brexit. The thing is about austerity, we've seen this time and time again, there's a double impact of people in black and minority ethnic communities. Because when people are fighting for what they see as scarce resources, then there's a double jeopardy on our communities. And with Brexit, of course, that it's undeniable that the xenophobic genie is out of the bottle. We saw just yesterday in The Independent that a pensioner was saying, we voted Brexit to a black woman and said, now F off home. This climate, Chair, this climate of it's okay to be racist translates down that path for this volatility of people not getting jobs or people not getting promotion, widening the pay gap.
Okay, Sean.
But both Brexit and austerity are moments in time. This is an enduring problem, isn't it? This is much older than both of those situations, significantly so.
Yeah.
So what's the drivers traditionally?
Well, traditionally, the uncomfortable truth is we still have the institutional disadvantage, race penalties, in which black men or black women, particularly with foreign sounding names, are not valued the same. And if they're not valued the same, then their talent is not recognised in employment recruitment and or promotion. Now, it's an uncomfortable truth, but to deal with it, we have to acknowledge it. It's exacerbated, Sean, by these other dynamics that make a bad situation worse.
I understand that, but I just want to almost get on the record that this isn't about Brexit, isn't about those things. This is a much longer.
No,
it's a longer tail.
We're saying that these factors make a bad situation worse.
Okay.
Okay, so briefly then, what's the relationship between other factors such as gender, age, level of qualification?
Well, we have this intersectionality that we need a nuanced conversation. A nuanced conversation means that it's not all the same for all ethnic minorities. And we can talk about that. Some of it's cultural, some of it is economical, class-based within our communities, and so they need to be factored in. What was the question again, Chair?
It was just the relationship between other factors such as gender, age,
Right.
level of qualification.
Yes. So these are all factors, and of course, where you live, whether you live in a more deprived area or not. What I'm saying is that we have the intelligence enough not to be crude. That it's simply that crude level of black and white. Within that, there are various shades.
Okay.
We'll get to them.
Well, on that then, Joanna, if I can ask you, can you tell us why different ethnicities have different pay gaps?
Very happy to.
Thank you.
I can't tell you why, but I can tell you what our research from BITC, Business in the Community, has found. Basically, we actually have been working with the EHRC and looked at the different cultural attributes and also the experiences of different ethnic minority groups within London, but also broader in the UK, and the impact there. I guess the colour of the skin had an experience in the workplace, and we particularly focus on employees in the workplace at the moment. What we do know is that, no surprise there, white British men earn the most. I guess we all knew that, that's a fun fact. We do know that in particular, if we look at the Southeast Asian communities, that there's a bigger difference between Pakistani, Bangladeshi colleagues compared to Indian, for example. So we know that Pakistani, Bangladeshi colleagues earn the least, particularly if we look at men. If we then split this out, for example, Pakistani, Bangladeshi women, we know that they tend to be more likely to be unemployed and have the highest rates of unemployment. So we can already say when we group people as Southeast Asian, that actually within a few, okay, it's a bit more than a few miles, but within that area, there's very big difference in terms of the experience that they have working here in the UK. Why is that? I'd like to open that up to the group as well. Again, I do think racism comes into this. I do think economic drivers come into this. Potentially cultural factors as well. I don't know if my colleagues here have any other thoughts on that.
Have you finished your comment?
Oh, I can throw some more facts at you
if you
like.
Finish your facts,
and then
I'm very happy to hear from you.
Sure. Actually, and I again would love to hear the thoughts from others on the panel, as we found that black African women actually earn more than white women because of generally really higher educational backgrounds. We know that British-born BME colleagues actually have smaller pay gaps than BME colleagues moving to the UK and working here. We know that the starting pay for a white graduate compared to a black graduate is about £4 difference for whatever reason, which it really should not be. we know that the groups that experience the most bullying harassment in the workplace, and what we're talking about is here on a daily basis and within the last 2 years, is for Black Africans and Bangladeshi colleagues. Again, to some extent, we think that shadism, colorism probably plays into that. Yeah. We also know that in terms of just comparing BME and white, is that in the workplace, often BME colleagues have to have a diversity objective compared to white colleagues who don't in their performance appraisals. To give you stats on that, we know that BME colleagues have around 38% of them have a diversity objective at work, whereas white colleagues only 27%. Why is that? Race is something we should all be talking about, so all of us should be having objectives around that. In terms of different minority and cultural backgrounds, I also looked at some education stats from the IFS from 2015, and actually what they found is that in terms of who is more likely to attend university in the UK, we know that 75% of Chinese children are likely to attend university. I can read the other stats to you. 67 for Indian children of Indian heritage, 57% of African heritage, 36 for Caribbean, and the lowest at 30% for white. So we actually do know that in terms of education and attainment, they've really, BME students are actually performing much better once they do have the opportunities to go and attend.
So that makes
I think there's a question coming in. Yeah.
I'll take it when I'm ready in a minute. So really, then that knocks the education side a possible reason for it.
Partly. On the other hand, we also know the Royal Academy of Engineering has done great research actually looking at engineers from Russell Group, as students from Russell Group universities, 6 months after graduating, comparing white and BAME. BAME are much more likely, and I'm sorry I'm using the label BAME for the moment, but are much more likely to be unemployed, whereas with the same university, same first degrees, and are more likely to be unemployed. Right. Why is that?
Well, this is what we want to try and get some answers for, because until you know why something's happening, you can't fix it, and clearly fix it we must. Did you want to come in on?
That's okay, sure.
Okay. Did anybody else want to make a contribution?
Yeah, I'll make some comments here. I think the issues around what's known as differential racialisation are really significant issues, that different groups, different minority ethnic groups, are treated differently. And it is a phenomenon with what we recognise, and it's mixed up with all sorts of different things. So it's mixed up around culture, it's colour, so monochronialism is a concept around colour, so people being treated just because of their colour rather than their culture or their ethnicity. So we do need to understand the complexity of this, and not try to sort of work it into a simple sort of equation of X equals Y. It's much more complex. And if you look at organisations that have tried to unpack some of that complexity, as it were, you start to see the intersectionality issues around class and around age and around gender dynamics, and you see those rubbing up against the differential racialisation issues. And so what you then get is some really interesting patterns coming out, and you can either look at the pattern, the equal pay pattern, as a block and say the difference between BAME and white, or to try and find some of the answers and some of the solutions, you need to start to unpick some of those things.
Okay. Right.
I can add just briefly, the original question around the volatility in the chart, I think is reflected by some of the answers. I think it's hard to say. It's extraordinarily hard to say because there are so many variables that have been discussed. It can be geography within London. Are we talking about City of London or Haringey or somewhere else? Are we talking about what industries was the sample population drawn from? At SCO London, we spend most of our time working with sort of elite industries from the city and some of the engineering firms and so on. That's a radically different world than folks working at Tesco on an average day. Front office versus back office roles. Again, who's in the population that's been sampled and how is that carried statistically through the data set. Seniority is also a function of promotion and access. And then also small business versus large business is another key variable. So I agree with everything that's been said, but I think the complexity and the unpacking, as you say, of these different issues is key. We work with the Royal Academy of Engineering that was mentioned earlier on that particular project. I think 2 years ago, 4 out of 8 interns at the House of Commons were SEO London sponsored students. So we focus on sort of pathways to power in our world and socioeconomic power. So I can't, I have to say, speak very in much detail about the world outside of sort of elite industries and professions.
But on that elite note, that we should be clear that, for example, pathways to the elite universities are too often restricted to many black and minority ethnic communities.
No.
And of course then that is problematic because if these big companies, these elite companies, as Andrew talks about, are recruiting from that pool, then we're locked out. When you look at yes, we're going to university. Our parents are telling their kids, you need to go to university, you need to get an education. But the universities that our kids are going to, 1, because they don't want to travel, 2, because that's the ones where they've been accepted. They're too often the universities in which too many of our communities are leaving and still struggling to find employment and or to get into those elite companies that Andrew might be wanting to work with. So it becomes by default that we're still being locked out of jobs and good jobs.
Can I add one more thing on the question around diversity and between the different ethnic minority groups? One thing, and I think that actually leads to it, when we talk about elites, and if we, being honest, mainly still run by white folks, and I think that's where the focus comes in, where working with our organisation, what we see at the moment is a really big focus and a trend on focusing on Black, African and Caribbean talent, because the representation rates for that particular ethnic minority group is ridiculously small and underrepresented across most of the public but also private, obviously, organisations that we work with. And one thing that I wanted to share with you, I hadn't mentioned before, is we looked at our Race at Work survey from 2018. We also ran the initial one in 2015. We looked at obviously what has changed in the last 3 years, and unfortunately not much. So we're not making progress, and I'm happy to tell you more about that later. But one of the stats that I wanted to share with you today is around, especially when we talk about progression and ethnicity pay, that's been particularly led for senior representation. We found that when in organisations you do performance appraisals and performance reviews, we actually found that mixed race colleagues are most likely to receive an outstanding performance review, whereas in particular Black Caribbean have the least or the lowest, are the least likely to receive an outstanding performance review. We also know the Bank of England has done, and some other organisations as well, done a fantastic project internally looking at the performance rating and then splitting them by ethnic minority groups to understand what are the difference. And we do know that if we look at performance reviews, which are an element of progression and promotion and pay, that white people tend to get more the outstanding or towards the 4s and 5s out of 5, and on average BME colleagues receive around 2 or 3 the average points. We do know that, and in my opinion it's mainly unconscious bias that's affecting at this stage and opportunities provided, but we do know this is a massive challenge for promotion and progression. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, it is sad. You said earlier, it's sad. It's really sad, and this bias is something that we must be looking at and seeing how we can try and do something. I think I'll move to the next section unless anybody else wants to. Sean's going to lead on the next section.
Let me just start with Andrew. To what extent do you think the ethnic pay gap is attributable to lower levels of education, particularly because you're talking about elites and that education you arrive with is very important, it's your first judgment point. To what extent do you think that is contributing to the problem?
Well, education is at the core of a lot of all of this, to be sure. The earlier the intervention, the better. We've started our program 20 years ago around a university population, and we're able to do very well with that, but we've noted in the course of that progress that we needed to be investing in secondary schools. So we created a secondary schools program. And the thing we find across the spectrum, and Simon mentioned this as well, there's a poverty of expectation at the secondary school level that needs to be addressed. And you can't aim for something if you can't see it. So this is allowing people to see what's possible is a core intervention. Secondly, people need to feel that there's a chance they're going to get it in an educational setting. Why try harder if it looks like I'm never going to make it? And that's another material item. The second thing is, okay, finally when you see the thing that you want, how do you get to it? And the ability to see the baby steps that can get you to the moon, that needs to be provided in an educational context. When you get to the university level, you're talking, people have sort of succeeded at a baseline level. They've shown up in time, got the grades, and they're into university. Then again, there's the same sort of standard issue of what can people see at that point? Can you see the moon to start building your baby steps to get to it? It has to be visible. And then the preparation on the way to getting there is also key. So the same issues sort of repeat themselves at both levels. But your question about educational attainment, the attainment itself is not the determining factor. It's the social capital you bring into that context and the social capital you build in that context, and then what you do with all of that down the road. We see, we bring in kids from the post-92 universities, we bring in kids from Oxford, Cambridge, and whatnot. And in any of those environments, it's just more prevalent in the post-92s. You'll see kids who may be first generation getting into one of these elite schools. They still barely know up from down. If you don't have a parent who is an investment banker or a lawyer or a doctor or a engineer or whatnot, you are at an inherent disadvantage. So I don't think it's actually the level of attainment. I think there's lots of it. We've seen from the Royal Academy work the view that there are actually more engineers from BAME backgrounds graduating out of post-92 universities than there are sort of Russell Group, yet that you still have these problems of access. It's not the level; it's what happens in that educational context.
To what extent do you think the lack of let me not presume, is there a lack of BAME representation at senior levels across these industries, and if so,
yes.
to what extent does that affect the area that you're talking about here, the belief, the designation of these baby steps? To what extent does it affect that?
No, I think it's a good question, and it relates to role models and the visibility of a pathway, the sense of that's something that I can attain. And so the lack of role models at senior positions both diminishes the visibility of the opportunity in the first place, lowers limits the ability of sort of constructing a pathway to that, limits the sense of that's something for me, if I try hard I can get it. And so I think by shifting the balance at the senior levels of all of these entities across the society, you would see more aspiration, more positive attainment, and more success. The group has mentioned earlier the notion of promotion. Part of this is retention. I think, frankly, from where I sit with the industries we work with, the notion of finding kids on campus to apply, it's sort of solved at a sense that there are lots of organizations out there now that can provide institutions with access to young people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's enough awareness that I think while that battle can still play out, the terms of that conflict are taken care of. It's now retention and promotion and advancement, and that is the new battlefield where the most important wars get fought. So relating to your point about if people are senior in these positions, that trickles all the way back down the chain to the school kid who's trying to figure out where they want to go, to the university kid who's starting to see what are they studying for and where are they going to apply themselves, to once they're actually in industry now, figuring out ways that they don't just go screaming out the back door as soon as they've come in the front. Because otherwise there's a ton of money spent on recruitment, front door, early stage careers, which is frankly wasted if the culture into which they're being brought, the workplace culture into which they're being brought, is not inclusive and supportive, and including those individuals in some key areas. This is how I break it down as there's value creation in a workplace setting, and there's value delivery in a workplace setting. Those two things. Are you who in the organization is creating the product that is going to market? Who is designing it? Who is shaping it? Whether it's a spreadsheet or a widget, and who is delivering that? Who's on the sales team? Who's actually interfacing with the client? Who's having those sorts of conversations where the value is being understood and delivered? And if people from disadvantaged backgrounds are not being put into that flow, they're not part of the story. They're just always going to be back in HR, back in the mailroom, back in the. It's just and that front office back office dynamic is real. People need to be rewarded for that. So yeah, you can do the value creation, like the ladies who put us on the moon. Forget that movie a little while ago. If they're part of the creation but not valued for it, that's an error. If they're delivering on the sales team, but someone else is getting the bonus check, that's another problem. But anyway, I'll stop there.
My follow-up question to that would be: is it the same for all groups? We had the concept earlier, entered earlier, about it's not monochromal. There's lots of different ways. I mean, growing up as a black boy in London, my outlook looked very different to my friend who's Turkish. So technically, we are both BAME. But he never viewed the world and still doesn't view the world in the way I do. Is that just my personal experience, or is that borne out by the statistics?
I don't have a ton of statistics, but I can tell you with the name Sean Bailey, you're probably coming out of sort of a West Indian diaspora.
Good guess, well done.
As opposed to the African diaspora, which is a different split. And I think if you're young and African and young and Caribbean, it's very different coming up, actually.
That's true.
Would someone like to speak to
that?
I mean, I think there's some things here that need to be really unpacked and looked at, and I think that when we ask this question around sort of intellectual property and low educational attainment, we do need to contextualise it, because we are having a discussion around UK, and there's a global world out there where, black and minority ethnic people, Asian people are educationally attaining huge amounts. So we just need to recognise that. And I think you're absolutely right about understanding pathways. If you're a young, black, African Caribbean girl like myself, raised in this country, the pathways aren't very clear for you. But as soon as I went to the Caribbean, as soon as I went to Jamaica, and I saw people that could fly planes, and people that were doctors, and people that were in government, and they were all black people, then suddenly there was a different story to be had about how you visualise yourself. So I think we do need to contextualise that there are some very limited pathways, as it were, or limited horizons in this country for young black people, and that really impacts on educational attainment and achievement. I think the other thing that we need to contextualise is also, intellect is not biologically determined.
Right.
And that's really important, because there's a lot of stereotypes around this, a lot of cultural and ethnic stereotypes about different groups and different kinds of determinations, and we've heard those stereotypes, but intellect is not biologically determined. But I do believe that there is a lot of unconscious working and messaging around that, which means that some groups are likely to weave through systems, as it were, than other groups, because of those quite powerful stereotypes about who are the smart people and who are not the smart people.
Right.
And I think that's really important to understand as well. So those contextualising what we're looking at, I think, is really important.
I think that's important, because on a psychological level, when you talk about unconscious bias, that can go one of two ways. I can be biased towards you positively or negatively. That leads me to my other question: is what does unconscious bias look like in an employment sense? I apply for the job. Yes, my name's Sean Bailey, but when I turn up, I am still very black. Yes. How does that work? My friend is called Kudret. Yeah, But so he may have a foreign name, but when he turns up, he looks very white. So what's the impact of that? Do I get to the interview and get rejected? Does he not get to the interview? Or is it the other way around?
It's complicated, and it works on a number of levels. So let's say, here's your CV, Sean Bailey. And some look at it thinking, oh, Sean Bailey, nice English guy. Good CV, let's bring him in. And then you show up. Oh. And then all the expectations they had have gone, and other prejudices are coming forward. And so that you will have then difficulty to prove your worth because of they expected a white person and not a black person. But of course, if your name was African and or Muslim, you might not even get to go because they've seen your name and they say, thanks, but no thanks. But I wanted, so, you know, in terms of African and Caribbean, there are various dynamics going on. Of course, because of slavery and colonialism and the black British experience, that Caribbeans in this country, through their parents and their grandparents, have been worn down by this race penalty. And in many ways, you know, we expect things not to work for us, whereas the African, unincumbent by this, that come to the UK and just thinks, you know what, it's opportunity time, and I'm going to open my business, and so, you know, that can be a benefit sometimes that we also need to unpack. I want to push back a little bit on Andrew. Maybe I misunderstood him wrong. There is a problem with attainment in universities. That black people can start university with straight A's and then leave with a lesser degree. And if you leave with if too few at that starting point are not attaining a first or a 2-1, that makes a difference when you're looking for a job. And so there's a problem within these institutions that we have to say are predominantly white lecturers and professors. I mean, not predominantly, shockingly. And if they have a perception of that student and they're then marking them down, then this is adding to this trajectory of not being fully valued. I think we let people off the hook when we too often keep talking about unconscious bias. You know, sometimes it's not so unconscious, and we need to confront that. I don't know. I've been in countless situations. You know, I think when Sean will know this. I think when you're, and I know Maxine and Jennifer will. When you're black, you know that when you come to the table, that you have to think to yourself, well, look, just to be listened to, just to be recognised, you have to dress a certain way. We're always smart. We like being smart, but we know that we can't turn up scruffy. You have to speak a certain way, so they don't say, oh, and the cliche is, look how articulate he is, just to get to go. But I've sat in recruitment situations, and this is another factor that we have to confront, that you have a black candidate that is brilliant, and a white female candidate that is not so brilliant. And I've been in situations where, of course, now there's a tension between tackling gender and race. And I've been in situations in which my fellow panelists have either said to one black candidate was not qualified enough, the other black candidate was overqualified, but the white woman was perfect. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm here and listening to that. But what happens when I'm not in the room? With these tensions, with these, I don't know whether, I cannot believe it's so unconscious. But it's a factor and it's troubling. We have another section where I think we can explore that a bit more. I just want to ask this question so I can give the chair back some of her time. I'm looking at here, which sounds like a very horrible statement to me. It says imposter syndrome. I've never come across this, so I'm going to tell you what it says on this piece of paper because I'm still a little bit horrified. It says, where high-achieving BAME candidates doubt their abilities, how does this play into things? I loathe this term, imposter syndrome. It's new to me, but could someone frame that for me?
Well, it's this, you know, I mean, one uses the language more and more, psychological language, and how one wants to narrate oneself within that language is really important, you know. So some people feel that it resonates for them, and some people don't, that it doesn't resonate at all. Lots of people, and this is not an issue around BAME people, feel that they're just not good enough. We know that the surveys we see, particularly when we look at gender issues, that women will do, you know, in terms of applying for jobs, if they don't feel they've absolutely got everything nailed on that, they won't apply. So we know that there's some issues around that. I think that how one articulates that in a personal level, so you saying you're not comfortable with it, I think is absolutely right. I think that, as I said, you know, it's not in and of itself an issue around race or racism, particularly to do with black or Asian or minority ethnic people. It's a way that some people see themselves.
The reason why you're running for mayor is because you do not suffer from imposter syndrome. And that's great. That's great. When you're being told time and time again, you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you'll never be good enough, get to the back of the queue, you're not getting promotion. When you find yourself in those situations where you have the relevance of being there, you feel an imposter. Okay. And there's intersectionality on that. I think it's compounded by race and gender. So it's worse for black women than black men. But Sean, it's real. It's real, and it's debilitating, and it serves no institution that talent cannot be recognised, because you feel that you're not worthy of playing that role when actually you're the best person.
I don't doubt the term. I just don't like it. Maxine.
Yeah. I've never heard of the imposter syndrome. People talk about self-limiting.
Yeah.
That's what you hear, and you hear people who are recruiting saying of BAME that they're self-limiting when they can't get the pool. So when you look at a talent pool and you don't get the talent pool you want, one of the things you may hear is BAMEs limit themselves, so they don't believe in themselves to apply for your roles. And that's often not the case. It means some employers need to do more to attract and recruit them. So for me, the imposter syndrome, yes, I agree with Jennifer and Simon. You see it all the time in the workplace that BAME candidates will need to get every single competency before they feel confident to apply for a role. Right. So you'll see in that aspect, but you also see in another aspect of when BAMEs, you don't have that talent pool, there's an excuse of self-limiting.
I suppose it goes to Simon's comment that it's the reality of constantly being set back every single time.
Yes.
You, at some point you capitulate, you accept that.
Can I add a quick point? Because this is something we see in our statistics at SEO London. 56% of all the young people who apply to our programs come through word of mouth. Just if you hold on to that statistic for a second. Social media, 10 to 15%. On-campus recruitment, 10 to 15%. Web search, 10 to 15%. Word of mouth, 56%. What that tells me is that students will see opportunities arrive through the ether. Opportunity to go do this, opportunity to go do that. But they're discounting them unless someone in their trusted network is actually saying, yeah, you should check this out. For me, when I went through SEO in 1995, many years ago, it was a 3 a.m. card game with a guy saying, Andrew, you should really check out SEO. It could change your life if you go do it. I said, oh, yeah, whatever, all right. And I applied the next day. But otherwise, wouldn't have occurred to me. I couldn't spell M&A to go for a job in investment banking through SEO. And so the notion of that word of mouth, I think it trickles back to a very clear point that unless people will discount away opportunities that are right in their face if they don't feel like it's attainable, that it's something for them.
And there's also the issue that Maxine was talking about, which is about, you know, if when you are in the workplace, so when you finally do get into the workplace, what are you permitted to bring of yourself into that workplace and what bits are not permitted to be in the workplace. And, you know, and again, I mean, I want to contextualise this because we're talking about United Kingdom, we're not talking about other countries. But, you know, it's very much a firm culture of whiteness in many workplaces. And as a black, Asian, minority ethnic person, you're walking into a very strong white culture, which is not a neutral culture. And most people think workplace culture is neutral. It's not neutral. It's very much a white culture. And that's the symbolism around the culture, the power dynamics of the culture itself. This is everything around the culture. And so for a lot of black, Asian, minority ethnic people, they're having to ask, what do I have to leave behind? What don't I bring in with me? What am I comfortable with? Do I have to change my accent? Do I have to not talk about certain things? And that can limit who you are in that environment, because you're not able to spread your wings in the way that you really can and demonstrate who you are, but instead you're constantly sort of tying yourself up.
Okay.
Enough.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Shell.
One of the upcoming questions, can we also have an angle on mental health? Because I think this is a really important point Jennifer just made, and I think the impact on the individual's mental health, hence the performance at work and the experiences, I just think, can we discuss that at some point during the questions?
Yeah, I'll come back to that. In the meantime, Sean, you indicated.
Yes, at the risk of opening a can of worms, I wanted to hear a few more words, because you've all hinted at it and mentioned it very briefly, about class. I think, you know, Andrew, you talked about, you know, having connections and word of mouth and all of those kinds of things. Simon, you talked about, you know, dressing a certain way and speaking a certain way, which are also things that working class people have to do to fit in. And in terms of, I recently had the diversity inclusion training that we get as counsellors in my borough of Camden, and one of the things that was quite new to me as a concept was the idea of fit not being a thing, that you need to be really careful as soon as you start thinking about fit, that you're being unconsciously biased towards people. And obviously that applies across race, but also across class, I think, and limits people in the same kind of way. And obviously it's intersectional because race and class are intersectional. So I just wanted to hear a few more words about that aspect of it, and whether in the UK, because we have a class system as well as a white workplace culture, which is quite in other countries as well, we need to be fighting sort of a bit harder against that, because we have such a class system in all of our elites.
Was it England that invented class? I mean, I don't know. It's an amazing feature of the landscape here as an American coming to the UK. You know, we have plenty of issues in the States, to be clear, but here, you know, so there's sort of an ingrained, in my mind, sort of class culture that is remarkable to witness. In fact, when we tried to start SEO back again 20 years ago, I was patted on the head, said, "Nice American, the sort of diversity thing you're talking about is really interesting. In England, we don't have a race problem, we have a class problem." And I think that carries through to today and just lumps challenge upon challenge. I think it's part of the main discussion with London versus ex-London. I think it's a huge aspect of it. I think it was the Social Mobility Commission came up with a report 2, 3, 4 years ago now that said it was young white boys from ex-London who are the most disadvantaged group in the society. I think that is a remarkable statistic. I don't know the basis of it, but if let's take it at face value, that's a hell of a statistic. And I think that goes straight to the point about class. So in our work, we talk about the big three in diversity and inclusion. One being ethnicity and ethnic diversity, another being socioeconomic diversity, and another being gender in the old-fashioned sense of women in male-dominated workplaces. And we feel we're perfectly sympathetic and empathetic to whether it's disability or LGBT or any other category. But those are the big three, and we think those are sort of where you can't tackle ethnicity issues without tackling class issues, and vice versa. It just doesn't. You're fooling yourself.
And even that term needs a little bit of unpacking, really. You know, so let's talk about socioeconomic deprivation, you know, as opposed to just class in and of itself, or social mobility. you know, because what you say, again, depending on different groups and how they wind through that, they may be economically deprived, but actually socially they're not, you know.
Yeah.
Or it may be that in terms of the nature of the kind of group or culture that they belong in, mobility is actually quite an important aspect of the culture. So, but again, maybe economically in a position to find that really difficult, or may not have had the opportunities to even see what socio deprivation really impacts on. So I think it's really just, you know, when we're talking about black and minority ethnic people, black, Asian minority ethnic people, we really do need to kind of think about that in a more nuanced way when we look at, and then obviously you've got issues around, again, intersectionality, you've got age, you've got experience, you've got gender dynamics within that. But I do think that trying to uncouple economic deprivation from social deprivation is an important way to start thinking about it.
And Simon, you mentioned austerity making things worse, because I mean that arguably has led to less opportunities for social and income mobility recently, which obviously would then, whatever efforts you're making on a cultural and racism point, you then blunting the ability for that to have an effect.
Yes. Well, it gets compounded. So you not only stop going forward, but you can go backwards. Look, I think Andrew put it really succinctly in terms of these elements are entwined, and you cannot decouple them, because what frustrates me sometimes is that people keep saying to me, well, it's not a race thing, it's all about class. And if you do that, for example, that Joanna spoke about the Chinese community being the high flyers in education. But when you look at the top jobs, they're still not there. When you look at Parliament, they're still not there. And so these things are not fitting. And of course, that if you talk about class in terms of working class white boys, is that they still won't be negatively targeted as black boys are by the police and or getting certain jobs. So we need a nuanced debate that, as Jennifer said, some of the Asian groups have a different mindset and trajectory that allows them to circumvent some of the problems that other communities have. I mean, you know, like some of the driven Indian communities that are, you know, making sure their kids go to various after-school clubs and just ploughing all their money into that, are giving them better pathways throughout these barriers.
Are you happy with that? Thank you, Sean. Did you want to come in on this section?
Yes, just briefly. So I'm quite interested in the word of mouth role models aspect, and the Fire Brigade's done some research that's been published on sort of what the barriers are to women and BAME recruits in relation to firefighting, and it feels like it's the same thing really. And I just wondered, there's been a bit of discussion about university, about attainment at secondary school, but are we pitching the level too late in terms of where you need to build in changes to this debate? For example, do we need to change children's books to sort of ensure that people have those appropriate role models? And actually, so do we need to make sure we build it into preschool education, primary school, rather than say this is what people are sort of doing, this is how we can reach out to young people in secondary schools? And are we still pitching where we're aiming to try and sometimes we talk about sort of raising aspirations, but actually there's no point raising aspirations if you need to know somebody to get your foot in the door as an intern, and there's no point getting your foot in the door as an intern if you then actually can't afford to do it because it's not paid or not paid sufficiently to live, particularly in London where costs are quite high. So where do we need to pitch the earliest interventions to make sure that we address this for the next generation?
As early as possible is the only answer, I think. I try and think about what's sustainable, and I try and think about what will get the most sort of broad societal buy-in, because it's complicated and there will be resistance. But I think the notion of changing books, you know, probably needs to be done, but it has to be done so carefully and so sensitively that you wouldn't want to just write a blank check and say, go change what you want to change, because you could lead down all kinds of dangerous paths.
It's not necessarily about changing existing books, it's about making sure that publishers understand their responsibility when they're publishing books for children, to make sure that they are not just sort of reinforcing existing
I agree. I think the answer is yes. It's just a question of, it's qualified, we've got to be really, really careful about how you do that.
I think there's a number of ways to do it. For me, the biggest deficit in which needs to be urgently addressed is the lack of black teachers in schools. I think the Department of Education, I think, or one of the unions stated there was a shortage of about 70,000 black teachers in schools. Now, black families, Asian families, when they are pushing their kids through university, they're saying, I want you to be a doctor, I want you to be a lawyer, I want you to, but they're not saying, I want you to be a teacher. They're not saying, I want you to be a fireman or woman, or fighter, or an engineer, or an engineer, or an engineer. So I think that, what are the dynamics? What are the dynamics that will change that? And I think that we've got to have a consciousness to say that we've got to tell our children, we want you to think of these roles because they're fantastic. They offer security for you to provide their families, but they will also change society. Because when we have black primary teachers and in secondary education, we'll have teachers that will see these kids, and when my son had one black teacher in his primary school, one black teacher, the kids loved him. He was doing fist bumps with them, he was talking about things that they could relate to. He was telling them that he wanted them to aspire, and they thrived. This is the biggest deficit that I would argue that would be most transformative in our society.
Jennifer pointed this out earlier about the trip to Jamaica.
Right.
I grew up in Jamaica, my mother's Jamaican. But going and seeing black pilots, black politicians, black policemen, it changes your world, right? All of a sudden, and so I think it's just making visible, because this is London. You got all kinds of people in London. This is an amazing city. Just if you can find and highlight those individuals who are making a difference, at all spectrum of diversity, women and LGBT and all that stuff. Make those people who are different visible. It instantly creates the pathways. As if this guy can do it, I can do it. If this lady can do it, I can do it. And you just bring that in as early as you can. I think that's fantastic.
Just picking up on Simon's point about teachers, I would say it's not just black teachers or BAME teachers, it's head teachers.
Sure.
It's the governing body, it's the senior leadership team.
Right.
It's all that make up schools, that lead schools. That's the change you need.
And that is a priority, but we are talking about a systemic issue here, aren't we? So if we only focus on one area, we forget the systemic issue. And it is a systemic issue. So the question is, what don't we look at? Because we need to look at everything, actually. It's around, the education arena. It's around housing and how people live arena. We know that the whole postcode issue for lots of young black men, not wanting to, being fearful to move outside of a postcode, and how that limits one availability to work, as it were. It's lots of different places that we're seeing this, because this is life. It is living in a world where you are not necessarily welcome. You are the alien. You are always told that you're different, and then treated in that way, and an expectation that you will then be different. So trying to think about that, and absolutely at the early years of education, to encourage young people to have different experiences and see themselves in those experiences. As a black parent, whether schools were doing it or not, my children were seeing black books. You know, we searched and scoured for black books that weren't necessarily from America. We had to think about education and how we could round their education, what they were missing in terms of their identity development within education. You know, talking about things like maths and saying, you know, that came from, you know, black societies, those ideas developed in other places. So trying to root them into the intellect, as it were, that they were learning, and some of the ideas they were learning in school, and rooting that back into culture was really important. But schools should be doing some of this as well. You know, it shouldn't just be the parent that has responsibility to do it. You know, schools do need to understand that, you know, these children at this very early stage in their development do need to see themselves and recognise themselves, you know, and need to know that that's okay to do so in a really positive way.
I want to add one more quick thing to that, and that is from a white perspective. So I really appreciate that, you know, my BME friends or colleagues, you know, their parents either have to say you need to work extra hard, and from an age 4, when we know when children start to understand the concepts of gender and race, and BME children and within their families most of the time have those conversations, white children don't. White children in white families do not talk about being white. And the reason why I know that is, as part of my job, what I do is let's talk about race training to adult employee workers, and having white 40-year-old men and women sitting in the room for the first time actually discussing the idea of whiteness, of blackness, of otherness, of the ideas of race. And if you're 40 years old and have gone through life, and I'm saying 40, but if you're an adult and have gone through life haven't even thought about your own race and the impact that this has had on your career, on your experience so far, that is obviously a benefit. That's white privilege. But at the same time, if we actually are looking at starting early, is there something that schools, I think, should be doing, so that not only the BME children have to learn about their culture, it should be all of them together. And I think that would support, I guess, hopefully the systemic issue that we're facing in the UK.
Thank you. That's a good point as well. Do you want to say anything more on your...
I just, this conversation I've had 100 times before in 100 different ways, but the thing that's missing here, when we talk about early intervention, how do we support parents? Because growing up as a black person in London, that's the real difference between me and my white counterparts, what their parents knew, what their parents expected, and the network effect, isn't it? You know, just silly things like my white friends, we were all broke, but they knew the cheap places you could go on holiday in Britain. We didn't, because my parents are also from Jamaica. You know, and going to Jamaica and also the US and seeing high functioning black people, just that was very impactful for me. How do we replicate that here? How do we support parents to be able to deliver for their children?
Well, I mean, you must look at the social infrastructure for that, and that then again comes back to some of the uncomfortable truths. Look, this discussion we're having today is part of a broader discussion, particularly over the last couple of days at Downing Street, with the violent crimes summit. That if we get this wrong, if there's no pathways for a good education, for opportunities, for jobs, there are other pathways, and they often involve criminality. And so unless we ensure that we open up these pathways and opportunities, there are gang members looking for vulnerable kids that they can recruit to be going on the county lines to sell their drugs. And then, of course, that then spirals it into a whole other...
What I'm interested in is if you look at the work that Operation Black Vote did around going to the black community and saying it is your responsibility to get involved, why don't you join me and become a magistrate?
Sure.
That was a very powerful piece of work. It had a long-lasting effect because this conversation, we can spend hours talking about how bad it is and what's gone wrong, or we can focus on things like that. Correct. That not only did some black people become magistrates, but that changed other people's culture because they're now viewing black people in a very different way.
And the point is, Sean, unless you invest in the infrastructure that Operation Black Vote and other organisations and other youth centres can survive, then you cannot be that bulwark within the communities that leads people to a different way, that leads their parents to say, look, if you want to change our society, become a councillor, become a magistrate, become a school governor. it is saying that we all have a role in ensuring that our landscape has those opportunities. Now, of course, in impoverished situations, you might need to invest more, because if the family structure is broken down, but they have an after-school club to go to, then you're giving them pathways in which they can get their lives back on track.
And we must concentrate more on the fact that this is talking about the ethnicity pay gap, because it's such an interesting subject. We could literally sit here all day and
I was just answering Sean's question.
I'm absolutely correct. No, I'm moving
I take
us
full
on
responsibility for leading you astray. I'm sorry.
I'm moving us on to the next book, which is Closing the Gap. I appreciate everything you're saying, and it is interesting and important to us. But if we stick to this, because we're trying to find some answers for the reasons for the ethnicity pay gap,
right.
So at least if we can concentrate on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this section looks a bit more at sort of practical ways that employers can make a difference. So I wonder if Maxine or Jennifer could explain how the House of Commons Diversity and Inclusion Strategy aims to support BAME communities enter employment and progress within the workplace.
Yeah. And the strategy is trying to take a whole systems approach. That's the first thing within the reach of who we are and what we do. So, I mean, the first thing around the strategy is the drive, the business case. Why are we doing this? You know, because that's always the question. Why are we focusing on this? And obviously there needs to be an evidential base underneath that. But, you know, one of the things that we're really clear is that, you know, democracy is stronger when it's inclusive and reflects all the people it seeks to serve. And that is our case for pushing this diversity and inclusion agenda forward, that actually this has a significant case for what we do and who we are as an organisation. So the first thing we've really focused on is around the evidence base. What is the evidence base? What is the stories telling us? Because many organisations are monitoring and looking at that data and really wanted to get that. And when I say the evidence base, I'm not just talking about the, you know, the quantitative data, but also the qualitative data as well. And the kinds of data that we're looking at things in terms of where people are, so grades and where people are. We're looking at appraisals, recruitment stages. We break our recruitment stages right down so that we can understand where people are, particularly BAME people, are falling off the recruitment process. Pay gaps is part of that. Promotions is part of that. We know where we are in terms of our data. We know we've got work to be done, and the strategy is clearly about challenging us to do that. The quantitative data has been really important as well, because it's about the experience of people in the organisation, how they experience the organisation. And, you know, we've done that through looking at our staff surveys, focus groups, and feedbacks from our equality networks. We've got an equality network, Parley Reach, which focuses on ethnicity culture, and they really are useful in terms of feeding back to us. Targets and benchmarks, so using the data to set the targets and be very clear why we're setting targets, so we know where the underrepresentation is. We're using the full range of the Equality Act, so we're really thinking about that as a dynamic, not just as a piece of legislation, and using and looking at positive action and the targets around within that act, you know, and saying particularly at our senior levels, that's where we see a significant fall off in terms of BAME groups, and that's what we need to target, and that's where we need to put targets. And then having smart targets, understanding that we're both a national organisation, but we're also based in London, you know, so understanding that at certain levels, as you start to hit the ladder, that you will be recruiting in a national way, but at the lower grades, what we call the less mobile grades, that will be a local target, it will be a London target, and understanding when we're using London targets and national economically active targets. So that's really important to us. Attraction and recruitment is a big issue. People have a view as to Parliament, the Houses of Commons, and we're trying to work through that so that people don't, you know, what they think is not what it is. You know, actually, in terms of diversity, we're much more diverse than civil service. So we are quite diverse. There's challenges, because yes, we know as staff move up the ladder, those figures drop off. So we know where our challenge is. But we've introduced things like we've introduced particular policies, like we have a press pause policy, which is that, again, using positive action, using the dynamics of the Equality Act, what we're saying is that for roles, we look at what the economically active benchmark will be. We use that as a benchmark to start with, so we know what we're expecting in terms of applications. We test it at application stage. If we haven't got there, we can press pause, we can start again, we can start the whole attraction process again. And as we go through the recruitment stages, we can keep testing against that benchmark and asking the question, are we hitting the benchmark? And obviously different roles and different functions, it will be slightly different. So we're using lots of evidence base to do that. And when you get to the final part, you know, you've got section 159 of the Equality Act, the tie-break clause. So you can use that. Organisations don't use it, but it is there. So starting to use those mechanisms to try and shift change, and using the data to drive that all the time. What should we look like? What should it look like at the recruitment stages? We're doing a lot of outreach activity. We have a participation team that goes into schools and colleges, but we're doing loads of outreach activity, and we're focusing on widening our pools in terms of encouraging people to look at the House of Commons. We're doing activities around internships, paid internships, rather than just who you know internships. Yeah. So for instance, my team run the Speaker's Parliamentary Placement Scheme. It's a paid internship programme. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's a 9-month opportunity. We specifically target underrepresented groups and people from social deprived backgrounds. That's where we target for that. They get an opportunity to spend 9 months on this programme in a member's office, so really at the chalk face of politics, as it were. And this is the 8th year we've been doing it, and those people absolutely fly. And these are people that have come from all sorts of different backgrounds. They may be BAME, which is one of our target groups, but they may come from quite deprived backgrounds, and they absolutely fly when given an opportunity, and that is an opportunity. We're looking at development, we're looking at leadership development, sponsorship development. We do things like reverse mentoring so that the senior people get a perspective from a BAME perspective on what it looks like. And actually that's been quite significant in terms of making change happen in the House. So staff have been able, BAME staff have talked about some of their experiences, and we've actually started changing things as a result of that. We did a large role model campaign, you know, so that we could find and seek out who are the role models in the organisation. And we did a campaign around those. We got their names, we got their images all over the house so that people could see there are people in lots of different functions doing really wonderful work, and you've got that pathway going through. Networks, we have lots of staff equality networks, but I've spoken particularly about Pari Reach because it's the one around race, but we have networks around all the diversity areas. And what they're there for is not just a sort of social meeting space. That's not their role. Their role is to act as scrutiny to the organisation, to tell us when we're doing things wrong and what we need to be focusing on. But, you know, importantly, they also are there to support their members as well, and to work with their members and develop their members. Work around learning, training, development, unconscious bias. I take the point that you made about conscious bias as well. You know, there is the two things hand in hand, and unpacking some of that is really, really important. And performance. So making this agenda a performance agenda so that it's not just an added on nice thing to do agenda. So, you know, diversity and equality, diversity and inclusion objectives in everybody's appraisals, and really drilling that into performance. We're just developing a whole performance infrastructure and governance infrastructure around our D&I strategy to manage that performance so that we make sure that we're doing what we said we're going to do. So that gives you a kind of flavour of what we're doing. We've got a long way to go, you know, we've still got work to be done, but we understand that it is a systemic, it's a whole approach, as it were, and not just focusing on one area, but focusing across what we do.
Yeah. I think you've answered quite a lot of the follow-up questions I had. I mean, that's a really thorough answer. I think that the specific question that I don't think necessarily was covered was around should actions be specific to different ethnic groups within the BME
Absolutely.
community?
So that's what positive action. Some people, you know, they're uncomfortable but around looking at targeted approaches. But actually, you know, the Equality Act, you know, legislates for us to do that, actually. and we should use all the drivers that we have. So absolutely, if the evidence base is taking us to a targeted approach, then we should be taking a targeted approach, because otherwise you're not actually going to deliver on that. So absolutely, you know, and that is about taking the organisation with you. It's about explaining to people why we might be taking a targeted approach, but being very clear it's because of what the evidence is telling us.
Okay, thank you. And I've met some young people who were on the speakers scheme a few years ago, and I think I absolutely recognise how you describe that. Obviously, within politics is one of the worst spheres for who you know and who you have known in your past. Gives you those sort of aspirations, but also sort of helps you get on potentially once you're in that sphere. How hard is it to actually crack the nut within who gets employed by MPs? Because obviously, I think that's probably because of the way the employment works. How does that work?
The MP is the employer. We're not the employer of MP staff. So
your scheme doesn't sort of relate to that then?
So what our scheme does is provide interns to members.
Yeah.
They are the employer.
Yeah.
We provide the sort of management of the scheme, as it were. But in terms of their own staff, they are the employer. But what we want to do is influence them to be good employers and to think about employment as a development opportunity. And it's really interesting because we're working with Operation Black Belt at the moment and a number of other partners, including Magdalen College and Oxford University, on a residential programme called Pathways to Success, which is going to be particularly targeting aspiring people that are interested in getting into politics, potentially being MPs. Yeah. And again, working on with that group. And we found that focused activities around this really work. But as you know, Parliament and the House of Commons, as I said, we can influence MPs, but it's a different employment relationship, and they are the employer with their staff. But we can influence them in terms of how they work.
Okay, thank you. And then moving on to Simon, I think, could you tell us a bit about what the key initiatives taken by government are, which are aimed at reducing the ethnicity pay gap, and maybe comment on whether the initiatives have had any impact?
Well, I think the biggest driver, of course, is data. And the ethnicity facts and figures has been the first in any Western government to lay bare uncomfortable truths. Now, we convinced the Prime Minister to go down this path. We had the conversations with her when she was at the Home Office, and we wanted a race equality audit of the Home Office. We thought that was critical. It got kicked into the long grass. But when she became Prime Minister, she said, well, why don't we do it right across Whitehall? And she's recognised that the gender pay gap has been a critical driver for beginning to close the gender gap. And so it didn't take much convincing for her to say we need an ethnic minority pay gap. Now, of course, if we want primary legislation, which we do, which we need, that you have to begin by consultation. So we've begun the consultation. I think it's now finished. But I think that once we get legislation, it will focus people's minds on how we get this. I mean, but I don't think we should wait for that if we want to make these changes. And whether it's us convincing the Prime Minister and or with Sadiq doing his work on this here, this is about leadership. And it's about, and there's various leaders down the spectrum that if you want to drive change, when Theresa May had all the data there, that I said to her and her team, look, it's all very well having the data now, but who's going to drive it? Who's going to formulate a plan? I have to say, I've known Jennifer for some time, and I know that she's worked in difficult areas like Northern Ireland and addressing disparities and inequalities and representation in that difficult area. She's brought that to bear with this. What you see in Parliament is a comprehensive plan. And it's not only a comprehensive plan that, as you said, Fiona, looks at a whole range of different areas, but they're bold enough and brave enough to really not just have a plan and drive it, but to question it. And so, you know, when they look at getting interviews and they think, well, hang on a second, we haven't got the enough people in those areas, they push back and go again. That's bold. That really is bold and brave, because the default position is, well, we've tried. What true leadership is, having a comprehensive plan and having those leaders to say, this is our benchmark. If you don't get that, go back and do it again. And I think that if you are persistent in that way, Fiona, then you will begin to make progress. What we're trying to do with the Disparity unit is look at those critical areas that converge, if you like.
Yeah. And would you comment on, I mean, obviously you've looked in this in some depth, and you mentioned the need for legislation. What other actions do you think the government should take to tackle this issue? We go back to the government actions and what we'd like government to do.
Sure. The other government action is to me, around the pay gap discussion, is procurement. is using the multi-billion-dollar purse to drive change. And again, you need one, the acknowledgement that it's a potential driver. 2, the plan. What does it look like? And 3, the driver. London is ideal for that. The Assembly is ideal for that. And the third element, of course, in terms of plan, has to be education. And it has to be with the universities and schools. And so we've got to get the universities into a better place on entry level, attainment and promotion. Because if this piece is not there, then the full flow pipelines are also inadequate. Because the big elites will say, well, where are they? We need greater numbers. So if we get them willing, the nodding, yes, 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 we're open for business, we've got to have the pipelines.
Great, that's really helpful, thank you. And then my final area of questioning is aimed at Joanna. So could you tell us what impact the Race in Workplace Charter has had since its launch?
So the Race at Work Charter was launched in October 2018. So at this moment in time we have 147 signatories. I've actually just updated them earlier this week. There are 5 commitments to the Charter, just a quick recap. They are fairly broad, because what we want to do is to have a Charter that employers can sign up to and then make it bespoke for their context. And just a quick recap of the 5 commitments within the Charter. There are to appoint an exec sponsor for race, so have that leadership element, have someone who's guiding the conversation, and someone in a powerful position who can do that and can make it a board agenda. The second commitment is to capture ethnicity data, but also to publicise progress. A lot of organisations, as we know, are already starting to look at it. Some already have it, but have not published yet. So we wanted to make it transparent, communicating it internally and externally. The third commitment of the Charter is around zero tolerance towards bullying and harassment, which we know is a really big challenge for employers in particular. We do know, and I take that back to what Simon said, very first statement around Brexit, we do know that bullying and harassment for BME colleagues has increased by 3% since 2016. The only thing that massively changed in our society is the Brexit vote and the open racism and discriminatory atmosphere, I think. Coming back to the Race at Work Charter, commitment number 4 is we want to make sure that all leaders and managers are accountable. So again, taking it back that really everyone needs an objective around the leadership element. And commitment number 5 is around career progression and making sure there are a lot of opportunities like mentoring, sponsorship, programs available within organisations. This is the charter that we launched. It's the first UK charter around race. There's a lot around gender and LGBT, but there wasn't anything on race. The impact of it, we will have an event in October, seeing 1 year on. So far we can say that, so it's been half a year now since it launched, if I get my numbers right, and we have 147 signatories. I think that's fairly impressive, and if we look at the quality of the organisations who have signed up, we have a really great mix across industries. We have a mix of private, public and also third sector organisations who have signed up, who have committed to it. And what we've currently are running from the beginning of March until the end of May is what we call the Race at Work Charter Survey. Very long title, actually a very short survey within 2 parts. First part about 15 questions that really relate to each of the 5 commitments. Where organisations who have either signed up or not yet just check through, am I doing this, yes or no, am I doing this, yes or no, see how I'm performing. And then the second part is a short case study of an initiative that you are doing internally for BME progression of recruitment or leadership. At the end of May, that survey closes. What we'll then be doing is create a report. So from there on, we will be able to say, at this point in time, the participants who have taken part, they have done X, Y, Z, and then we'll be more able to bring an impact report, probably publishing around October time this year. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of my colleagues wants to come in a moment, but I just wanted to finish by asking whether you think it's more effective to tackle bias head-on alongside other initiatives such as giving managers performance objectives to support fairness for staff.
Absolutely. So we do know that unconscious bias training, the way it's currently run, doesn't work, and that's because we're doing a one-day off training. People feel better about themselves, they now learn something, and then they go back to their desk and on Monday mornings like, what was it that I learned about? If we look at how we've run learning and development within any organisation, and again I come from a business angle here, but if we look at the learning and development professionals in our workplaces whose day job it is to design learning initiatives, design workshops, training programs, there's always a refresher element, there's a reiteration element. You need to consistently talk about an issue to actually understand it and fully grasp it, and I think that's what's lacking at the moment. So yes, the answer is unconscious bias training. While I still think we should have it, embedded in anything that we do in our organisations, publicly or privately. It also needs to go along processes that reduce the impact of unconscious bias. And taking back to Sean's question initially, if he comes to an interview, how do we get bias with your name and your Turkish friend? It's not only at that point. Unconscious bias is through all the processes, and I'm sure Maxine and Jennifer will know that actually structured interviews where you and your friend, you both get asked the exact same questions, will reduce unconscious bias. We do know that if there's no structured interview, you probably get more difficult questions, and hence you might not perform as well. And the answer is, well, Sean didn't really do so well, did he? Was that actually up to your merit or not? It wasn't. You had a very different experience. So there's a lot of ideas and processes that we advise organisations on to remove the unconscious bias or try to limit the effect at least by using more processes. And one of them is also the one that Jennifer obviously mentioned around challenging lists and anything that you're being given. And that challenge is the key.
And how effective is name-blind recruitment?
It's very effective. However, it's not only the name that needs to be removed, ideally university as well, and any personal identifications. For example, we know that particular students, sometimes hobbies, interests, like, oh, you like kayaking as well, and then suddenly you have that affinity bias within the interview. So we do know it's really age as well, yeah, absolutely. And we do know that it is effective. However, one thing to flag, there has been a research in Australia on name-blind CV, and it actually created negative results because sometimes IMD teams are trained to have that positive action element, and with that being name blind, actually sometimes BMEs and women were singled out. So I'm just saying that while we really need to improve, yes, name blind, to remove unconscious bias, we need to do it in a really process-driven way to still sense check with the data who is getting through and is it working. So not just name blind is the solution, it needs to be kept in check.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Leonie.
Thank you. And so sorry I was late. I'm actually substituting onto this committee for someone else and had another engagement. Obviously, this is a really important area. That's not, me being late is not a reflection of my consideration of its importance. I've worked in the private sector, the public sector, and the third sector. And my perception has been, perhaps this has changed more recently, that there's been probably more resistance to training for things like unconscious bias or name-blind recruitment or positive mentoring in the private sector than probably in the public sector or probably in the third sector. And I wondered if you felt that was the case, and it would be quite interesting to see what comes out of your survey when it's finished and you review it in a year's time. And if that is the case, do you think, and then probably broaden that out to Maxine, Jennifer, and maybe Simon as well at that point, do you think that outsourcing from the public sector to the private sector has had an impact in terms of ability to have a properly fair recruitment process?
If I just take the
just
first part of the
start first.
question, and then
I'm very happy for Andrew to come in as well if he feels he wants to contribute on that.
in terms of fatigue of training, absolutely, but simply because if you don't see an outcome, why do you go? So as part of my job, I also deliver training to a range of senior leaders or frontline staff around unconscious bias, around race, around inclusive leadership. They all come out of the training wide-eyed, having that light bulb moment. This is a great experience. But again, how do you translate that in an ongoing training element within the workplace? My experience has not been that private organizations have a fatigue or resistance with that. Actually, it's the opposite. So over the past 2 years, our engagements of how our partners use our expertise, actually training and delivering training, mentoring, or helping with developing sponsorship program has increased. So there's a clear demand for it in the private sector. I think it is fueled by things like the gender pay gap, because you have to do something now, and you have to write in your action report that we are taking action to solve the 38% in the finance sector that the pay gap has brought to life. So I think there's actually a really big increase. What we do see, particularly from advanced organisations, what I mean by advanced in terms of INDs, I'm talking about professional services, so the likes of KPMG and the other big four, is a really clear focus on black representation and leadership and mentoring and sponsorship programs. So actually we've seen an increase in the last few years in that. So I would argue that there's actually, people want to actually run those programs more.
Okay, so there's been good buy-in in the last couple of years. So I wonder if I can throw that over to the rest of you. Is my feeling from my observations over the years that there's been better practice in the public sector over the years, and has outsourcing now impacted on that? Because obviously with local authorities being very strapped for cash, that has always been an area I always felt where there was possibly more fairness in terms of who was being recruited into posts. Not necessarily in terms of who got promotion, and the whole snow-capped issue of, you'd find people at all levels but never at the top. It was always white men who were still in the upper posts. Has that started to change? Is outsourcing an impact on that?
Well, I think it's back to the point that the other speakers were making about how one deals with one's outsourcing, how is procurement and supplier diversity part of your D&I strategy, and it's clearly part of our strategy. So, I mean, in terms of the house, most of the employment relationships are actually employment relationships. We don't outsource as much as civil service and local authorities. Our cleaners are our own, our caterers are our own, our security people are our own, and that means that in terms of ensuring that people get the same message about what's important, ensuring that we can look at how people are developing the organisation, that helps as well. But where we do procure, and we all procure services, facilities and various other things, it's really important to ensure that diversity and inclusion is absolutely central to that, to get that, if you're going to be spending money, to use that power to be able to put into your contractual relationships, and this is what we expect. So in our contractual relationships, we have, in fact, Maxine has developed a really good process where we can assess the quality of the contractual relationship and say this is at excellence level in terms of diversity and inclusion, this is what we require of you in terms of monitoring, in terms of thinking about your staff, things of delivery, training, etc. So we, and we can do that because it's our contract. So that's really important that
that's
one does.
Really interesting, and it's a really important point about the quality elements of procurement. It's one of the things I come up against all the time. I'm, my two boroughs, Merton and Wandsworth, I'm also a Wandsworth councillor. We outsource, if it's not nailed down, we outsource it, and we assess all of the tenders on meet, most economically advantageous tender. And I have argued in many meetings that we don't look at quality, we don't look at any of those issues as well. And obviously, if you're not putting those in the first place, then you can end up with unfairness, can't you?
Yeah, but it's building diversity and inclusion
at the beginning.
Yeah, and that's important. And then measuring. So it's not just being satisfied with responses; it's measuring those responses.
I think there's kind of variance between the private sector, the public sector, the third sector. I mean, there are certain private sector companies that see diversity and pay gaps closing pay gaps for gender and race as an economic imperative, and that's a real positive driver. Look, these companies that Joanna talked about, they're global companies, and they need a global workforce, and so they're recognising that the bottom line is affected if that's not covered. And then, like McKinsey's, they're selling that to other companies too, to say that the stronger you are in this area, the better you'll be. I mean, in some ways, when you look at the public sector and the third sector, that you will have found there's lots of kind of talk about, we want to be fair, we'll have all this diversity. But when you look at the structure itself, nothing much changes. And so there's this patting themselves on the back that they're talking about this, but too often there isn't the driver. Before you came out, I spoke about the colour of power, and the colour of power in the third sector, in the public sector. Too often, women are not at senior levels, and that is chronically so for black and minority communities. All these sectors that talk lavishly about diversity, but without the, critical to it is, Jennifer's talking about this, is the drivers. And of course, the big driver that we haven't really had time to look at in any meaningful way is procurement. Again, yeah. I keep coming back, the meaningful procurement. One example that we looked at very quickly with universities, so I'm speaking with government officials, and I'm saying, well, how can we ensure that they have a plan for tackling race inequality? And somebody said to me, well, all you have to do is to look what they did with gender. That I think it was Sally Davis. Sally Davis said on medical research that universities would not get that money unless they signed up to Athena Swan. Athena Swan was the framework to deliver gender parity. You know what? Within 2 years, almost all of them had signed up to it. Yet the Race Equality Charter is still only taken up by a small number of universities.
So that's really interesting. My follow-up question, Chair, if I may, having explored whether there was a difference, and I think what you're saying is there isn't at the top. There is no difference, right. Snow-capped everywhere. Right. My follow-up is we have got some legislation, and when I haven't done recruitment now for some time, but I did use it quite extensively, and we ended up with a very diverse organisation from top to bottom, very reflective of the people it was serving and so on and so forth. So I know it can be used. Yeah. Is the legislation good enough for what we want to do? It's very different in America. We don't use the words affirmative action over here. Obviously, positive discrimination is not a good thing, but positive action is a good thing. Are we actually in need of further legislation, or is the legislation sufficient for our purpose, and should people be using it more and more effectively?
It's really interesting when we start talking about positive discrimination and positive action, that we're sitting in a very particular paradigm. The first equality legislation in this country in the 1940s after the war was actually positive discrimination, because it was about people coming back from the war who had disabilities and ensuring that they got jobs. So, the agenda has moved on. It's really interesting in Northern Ireland. When I worked with the Northern Ireland Police Service, which was then the RUC, transforming it to Northern Ireland Police Station, the first thing we had to look at was the legislation. How are we going to do this very, very quickly? So, you can get thrown into this bad, good argument. Right. And actually, I think that in lots of ways, you need to understand the history of this legislation that we've been using and how it works in different places and in different ways.
Which is why I quite like the American terminology of affirmative action, because it kind of takes out the
discriminatory language.
I don't like the language either.
So when there have been times, in our history in the UK, when we felt the need to make change happen very, very quickly, because it's been absolutely urgent and vital, like people coming back from the Second World War and needing to get jobs and they were disabled and nobody wanted to give them the jobs, we put legislation in. When we recognised as part of the peace process that we needed to ensure that the police service was a service and not a force, and that it included all the communities and not just a particular community, the legislation was changed. So I think it's really important to recognise how you're using the legislation and why you're using the legislation. I don't think that most organisations use a full spectrum of positive action and really stretch that envelope of positive action, you know, and see what that actually means. So I think there's more work to be done around positive action, but I think that if the evidence base leads you to a place where you're saying something urgent needs to happen, then there are examples where we've changed the legislation.
And you look at areas like the police force, for example, that you could stretch it there, because you've got to police by consent, you've got to get trust, you've got to build the confidence, and this is a measure. Teachers too, that how can it be when you have sometimes 80-90% black and minority ethnic students and you have 10% BAME teachers? that we've got to be able to have a mechanism, and when you talk about removing the language that people bunker down when you say positive discrimination. For example, all women shortlists is a good thing because you're addressing a chronic imbalance that cannot be addressed in the short term any other way by saying, look, we need to fast track talented women. So
there might be a bit of a split in the room on that one.
Well, there might, and can
I just quickly nip in? I've got a few small ones. You say that you've had a lot of organisations sign up. Are any small organisations signing up? Because for a lot of young black people, they get their start with a local small organisation that is prepared to look beyond colour, class, creed. How many small organisations are signing up?
Not too many, if I'm honest. Generally, if we look at our reach with our partnerships at BITC, it is mainly, well, any businesses, private or public, but tends to be more the bigger ones. However, what we're really advising all the time to particularly, bring up KPMG again, but they are using suppliers, and we're really impacting for even bigger organisations to look at supply chains to kind of spread the message and enable them as well. So to your question, not many currently signed up. I wish they would, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on how we can reach out better to those.
And just to go to Simon's point about third sector organisations, public organisations talking very lavishly about it, do they sign up? Because some of the worst organisations are government departments, unions, talk lovely about it, but they are behind where even private businesses on this. Do they sign up? Are they in this conversation?
Yes, we have also public organisations signed up.
Okay, thank you.
Now we're coming to the last section, which is...
Yes, my questions are about what the Mayor is currently doing in London. There's quite a lot of initiatives in the GLA at the moment. We've got the vision for a diverse and inclusive city, which is the more broad strategy for affecting London as a whole. Then internally within the GLA, we've got our own action plan, which is the ethnicity pay gap action plan, which has lots of specific actions. Some things have already been done. Anonymised recruitment was introduced. They have introduced training on unconscious bias. There are things coming in the coming year, things like making sure that interview panels are gender balanced and ethnically diverse, which is reasonable, I think. But there's an awful lot in there. Separately, the Mayor also has a good work standard, which may clash with what you're doing, Joanna, a tiny bit. Within that, there are diversity and inclusion requirements that are similar, but not exactly the same as in your charter. So I just wanted to ask each of you internally, what do you think of what the Mayor's doing externally and internally in regards to this? Kind of this set of issues. Is he doing enough? Is it coherent enough? Is he missing anything? And what more would you like to see? So I don't know which direction to go.
Andrew?
I don't know. I have no idea what the Mayor's doing. I first heard about anything in this briefing, and I'm not particularly proud of that, but this is a fact. We work in a world which is very sort of focused on kids and sponsors of our activities. And upon reading this, it looks fantastic. So the one thought I had was within this concept, the standards that are given, there's 1 to 5. I would say all of them are great. The one around workforce representation and ensuring that the workforce represents the London labour market, I think is, I would just say yes, but close is probably good enough in that context. I wouldn't, don't need to be draconian about it to a certain, beyond a certain extent. But no, I have very little visibility into what the mayor is doing today.
I'd agree with that, and I would argue that actually one of his special skills is actually PR and talking about the great things he's doing. So it would be great to have that angle on internally inclusion and diversity, bringing out into the open a bit more. GLA is a member of BITC, so we're advising them in detail, and your dedicated advisor will be happy to give more details on the specific plan. One thing that I think the mayor has the power to do is, in particularly the campaign he's currently running, London is Open or campaigns like that, where is the diversity linked to that? So, again, in the external marketing, it is visible. There's visible diversity in what we're doing. How does that translate in how he holds sort of the businesses in the city to account to do their part? So that would be great to see a bit more push, because what we do know is that, again, leadership, you need someone driving that, and currently that's not coming from the senior leaders of the country. So perhaps him as the Mayor of London, he has a role to play in that.
Can I just follow up with a couple of quick factual questions with you? The action plan on the BAME pay gap action plan references that we've signed up to the community charter, but has the Mayor talked to you about developing the good work standard? Because that, as far as I can tell, is the thing that might leak into procurement. It doesn't yet, and it's been soft launched quite recently, but it says in relation to procurement, they would be able to use their accreditation to demonstrate social value when competing for public sector procurement opportunities within the GLA group. So it's a bit indirect. It's not saying you must be signed up to the Good Work Standard in order to bid, but it's saying it may be a way to demonstrate social value. And obviously you're probably quite well versed in all of this. I just wondered if you were advising the Mayor on this standard.
So me personally, no, but I will pick up with my colleagues who work with the GLA to find out if they do. I would question, why isn't it a requirement that they are? You mentioned that they should be signed up, but they don't to bid for it. Why isn't that a requirement?
It's quite voluntary, as far as I can tell, and not that many employers are signed up yet, although it has only been soft launched, as what the Mayor's been saying in response to questions from us.
Just in terms of experience, again, make things mandatory as much as you can. The moment it's voluntary, no one will do it.
Yeah, we've experienced that with living wage, for example, and in spreading that out of the public sector into contractors, it has to be mandatory.
Again, sorry, I know we're talking about the ethnicity pay gap, but with the gender pay gap, we've been arguing for this for years and nothing has happened. The moment it's become law, suddenly everyone obviously has to do it, and the conversation is there. So with the ethnicity pay gap, we just can't get here quick enough so that we can finally get this topic discussed more broadly.
Great. Sorry, carry on.
No, that's exactly right. And in regards to what the Mayor's doing, I think that we should applaud his initiative on the ethnic minority pay gaps, because he is the first significant mayor leader to champion this, and I would say I'm always impatient.
Can I just ask you, do you mean globally or just in this country?
In this country. I don't know globally. I don't know globally, but let's stick to this country, which is significant.
But even so, the first here. That's shocking, really, in a way.
It's really shocking.
Yeah.
But
he's been doing it for a little while as well.
Right, right. But it's okay. But Theresa May, to have that balance, is the first leader to have the ethnic minority, the disparity across Whitehall, laying bare uncomfortable truths. So the first thing is that to applaud him for that, but then to push him, because being a leading figure, that he should convene the top businesses and saying, look, I'm doing it because it's the right thing for good governance, but you've got to do it too. So use that leadership position to spread that word and cajole leaders into that. The second point, and I guess this is what the Assembly holding him to account, that I think it's important, particularly with the other strategies, that you've got to say to him, okay, so you've set this framework, who's going to drive it? What are the benchmarks? What is your time scale? Because as Jennifer said, that you can have a framework, but unless you're driving it and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, I tell you, you all know that slippage, not being focused, not getting to your place easily happens. And I think that it's your role to hold him to account and push as hard as you can.
Okay, so I mean, from our perspective, we're politically impartial, so we can't really make comments directly about what the Mayor is and isn't doing. But what we can say in terms of recommendations, in terms of developing a strategy, is that you do need to make it a whole systems approach, that it does need to be focused, that it does need to be evidence-based. It should be pulling those drivers of influence, leadership, and as Simon has said, managing performance. So, you know, being very clear, what do you want to do and when you're going to do it and how you're going to get there, you know, is just very, very clear. You know, are there targets? What are those targets? How are you going to meet those targets?
I'm constantly monitoring him and doing the assurance bit. And that's the most important to measure.
So one thing that's in, I wanted to, obviously, okay, maybe you can't comment. I was just hoping to draw out where there might be slight differences in just some of the practical things that you're doing. One of the things that the Mayor's said that they will start doing by this April is analysing gaps in honorariums and additional payments and bonuses and that kind of thing. I can't see in the document whether they're also analysing disciplinary and other, because there seems to be disparities in both sides of that. Are you doing that within the House of Commons? Are you looking at bonuses and payments and whether there's disparity?
We've been doing that, particularly with the gender pay gap, so we've specifically looked at that because that's where we realised there was differentials actually, and it was in regard to bonuses, and so had to really do some action around that. And as we start to formalise, we're not at the moment publishing, but we're starting to look at the data around ethnicity and pay gap. We will do the same, because once you start to see where the gap is, you need to start to dig under that and work out why the gap. And sometimes it is because of, as you say, bonuses or honorariums, or, you know, just the nature of the way that the employment is prescribed in the organisation. So I think it's once you start to get that data, you really need to uncover, and that's what we've done with the gender pay gap, is really unpick it and try to understand where we've seen, generally we haven't seen a differential across most of our staff, but at the senior ends we've seen a little bit. And that is because of sort of bonus payments, and so we've had to unpack that, and now we've developed, are developing new policies around that.
And do you have requirements for diverse interview panels in the same way?
Yes.
Right,
yes.
okay. Yeah. Just one final thing, the police service in London has recently relaxed a requirement for residency in London because of the need to, well, they say it's because of the need to recruit new officers rapidly. And I just wondered if any of you had any comment on the effect that might have on the diversity of the police service. I think they've roughly admitted that it might have an effect. But
I used to work for the police service some time ago in their training arm, so the 43 boroughs rather than the Met Police as the head of diversity there. And you know, the thing about the local police services is that you need to understand the local issues and capturing, you know, the police services always move people around, and the challenge with that, particularly in London, and why the Met has been set up in such a different way, is that you really need to understand the nature of London. You really need to understand the nature of those communities and those diverse communities. And it's not just about recognising them, it's really understanding that at a very kind of emotional level, because this is a real significant power dynamic. You know, when you go in as a police officer, you have a huge amount of power, and if you don't understand where you stand on issues of ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, whatever those issues may be, the way that you perform your function will be limited by that. And if you're experienced in living in diverse communities, you've picked up some nuances that those that haven't will learn. I mean, it's learnable. I'm not saying it's not learnable, but we do need to recognise that if you don't recognise and understand diversity, then that's a gap, a knowledge, an experiential and skill gap there. And my question would be, how do you therefore meet that?
The worst case scenario of that situation is somebody that has not lived in a multicultural metropolitan area, and their view of, for example, black men is one of aggression, is stereotypical, and this person comes with all that power, with all that prejudice, that we've seen it in those video nasties where the interaction has been awful.
One of my staff got stopped by the police just a few days ago, and exactly that dynamic. This guy, God bless the police, but this guy was an idiot. Who was stopping him. So it's troubling. Could not relate at all.
Right, and of course that then interaction then can quickly spiral into something quite dreadful.
Yeah. But everyone in the sorry, we sort of stick to the pay gap rather than the general diversity of the police. But in terms of if we have a wave of recruitment now that's less diverse, that's going to ripple upwards, isn't it? Throughout, in terms of changing the pay gap later on.
It wasn't like we were recruiting from London and getting a really diverse set of people. So that wave will not be changed.
It was improving a tiny bit.
Yeah, but it hasn't stopped that. It's an addition. It's not saying we won't recruit from London. It's saying we'll recruit from a wider pool. So I can't see the change being significant or even any at all.
In proportional terms, I mean, yeah, you're right. It's because they need to recruit more. Yeah. Numbers, and they're not getting enough numbers.
That don't understand won't help.
It goes back, Fiona, you're asking about early
It's not necessarily
on
direct like that. And again, it goes back to Jennifer's point. No matter where you get the police from, I think it's about how they're trained. They've got to learn that interaction.
Mm. And they are getting unconscious bias training. It may just be one-off, though, like you say.
But if they are actually diverse and they're working alongside colleagues from, all different backgrounds and interacting on the street with people from all different backgrounds, it definitely has, an improving
aspect. But we're making an assumption here that the people are diverse because they came from London.
Yeah, and we've got to also appreciate the fact that we need police officers, and if we can't get them from London, they've got to go. But we must go back to the ethnicity pay gap. Have you finished your section?
I think I've asked all the questions.
Lovely, thank you. While we're on that subject of the gap, this is clearly an issue for the Mayor. The GLA's got a pay gap of 11.4. The Met have got a pay gap of 16. The Mayor's Office for Police and Crime, which is MOPAC, is a 10%. The London Legacy Development Corporation is 24%, which is shocking. London Fire Brigade, I see, is 0. A lot of work has gone into that, but I'm not sure that that's right. But Old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation 70%, and TfL 10%, but that could link into such high bonuses that have been given for the hierarchy, and that could have made that worse. I mean, it just very, very, very briefly, because I'm mindful of time, how can the Mayor address this? Because it's good that he's mentioned it, and he has to, and it's good that he's brought it to the fore, but you've been saying it's no good bringing it to the fore without actually doing something about it. So if you had one very brief, quick comment to make on what he could do, how would he change it? And I'll start with you, Maxine.
He needs to unpack it. That's the first thing. Why is it occurring?
Okay, Jennifer.
And once you get to the unpacking stage, is there intersectionality in there? So is it, BAME women? Is it Asian? Is it Black British? What is going on there in terms of trying to understand? Because then you can do the targeted work around that.
Yeah, because it's so much more complex than it looks.
Who wants to understand it? Comprehensive programme, dynamic driver that delivers change.
Based on all of that, to add, looking at senior appointments in particular, and the pipeline before that, just below the board level, or whatever the equivalent is.
Good point.
Yes, because it can.
So sponsorship in particular.
Yeah.
And mine's related. I think it's about retention, promotion, and the incentives that drive that.
Right. Okay. This has been so interesting. I mean, we could all have gone on for a lot longer because it gets more interesting as we broaden it up. But have any of my colleagues got anything else to ask with regard to this? No? Okay. Can I thank our guests for their contributions to today's meeting? It's been very interesting, thank you. Can we note the discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree an appropriate output from this meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the topics covered during the 2018-19 Assembly year and the schedule of its provisional meetings for the committee for 2019-2020, subject to agreement of the calendar of meetings at the annual meeting with London Assembly on 2nd of May.
Noted.
Can we delegate authority to me in consultation with party group leads to agree any further outputs relating to the committee's investigations in the 18-19 Assembly year and arrangements for any site visits, informal meetings or engagement activities before the committee's next formal meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 7th of May 2019 at 10 a.m. in Committee Rooms 5, City Hall, subject to confirmation at the annual meeting in 2019. Now, there is other business. I'll just read this if I may. I'm accepting this item as urgent business in accordance with section 100B 4B of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, and there is a need to consider this item at the earliest possible opportunity. Can I ask the committee therefore to note the documents received from London and Partners in response to the Economy Committee summons attached to the report as appendices 1 to 16 of the supplementary agenda?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Meeting's ended. Thank you very much.